So welcome, dear friend. It's a great joy to be here to welcome Bill McKibben for a dialogue with a number of our friends. It's so important that we learn how to act from our heart. And I think we really look up to Bill as somebody who's acted from his heart from his early days as an activist. And so thank you so much for coming here. I'll just introduce briefly for those of you who don't know Bill. So Bill McKibben is a climate change activist, author, and journalist. He wrote the book The End of Nature in 1989, which introduced much of the West to the climate crisis. And I first met Bill in 2001 when he spoke about his book, The Age of Missing Information, which is an experiment he did to watch 100 channels of cable TV, and then over the course, 24 hours of 100 channels of cable TV in a year as a way of looking into the mass media, and I was very impressed that his declaration that the main message that comes through all of that is that I am the most important person. That is what the TV is telling us. He founded 350.org, which is in 2008 with many others, which has continued to be a major force in organizing climate marches, divestment from carbon emitting industries, and has continued to work in the areas of racial, social justice, and addressing the climate crisis. So welcome, Bill McKibben. Thank you for being here with us.
A real pleasure to join you.
And so on my left is Br Phap Luu. He's a composer, a monk, great vegan cook, and climate crisis hopetivist. He just came up with that word. And I'm Br Phap Luu. I'm also a monk and hoping to change the world to make it a better place through breathing and mindfulness. We also have Phoebe Tickell, who describes herself as a moral imaginationist. She studies the complexity of perception, and her work is deeply informed as well by the Dharma. We have Felipe Viveros, a practitioner, friend, activist, ecologist, and troublemaker, and Naima Ritter, who's a spiritual activist, coach, co-founder of Conscious Co-Living, and she's recently been helping with sharing circles to help people move into a new paradigm of this is emerging in this new world after the pandemic, and also with a friend. So we're gonna just start it off. Maybe if you want to start something.
Yes. So we're really, really honored that that Bill, you were willing to join us very much at the last minute like this, and joining not just us here on this call, but almost 1,000 people who are participating in our current retreat, Love is the Way. And then also, I'm sure beyond that, we're going to make this session live on YouTube. So I think probably hundreds, thousands of people will be interested to tune in and participate too. So we wanted to invite some of our young friends who are involved in the environmental movements, all kinds of different movements, to kind of represent all of those other people. So our initial hope was to do a live Q&A with you, but because we couldn't do that for technical reasons, we invited some friends to represent our community to ask you their questions of the heart. And I think all of us are aware of and breathing with the great pain that is in the world right now, that so many of us are in touch with at a personal level. I think so many people are facing their own health challenges, or know somebody who is, or may have lost loved ones, or just be dealing with the anxiety of maybe getting sick at some point, or the uncertainty of losing a job or potentially losing a job. just change, or just being confined in one place. And that is kind of compounded by, you know, the great kind of pain of the situations of racial injustice that we see daily on the news, and then kind of looming behind and around, encompassing all of that, is the heating of the planet, the kind of the current collapse of so many aspects of our ecosystems and the planetary life support systems. And so knowing that we're all, you know, whether we're looking at it directly or trying not to look at it or trying to ignore it or whatever, it's there. And it's kind of, I think we're all feeling it. And so our hope with being with you tonight was also maybe that we could together embrace some of that pain and have the courage to look at it, and also maybe find the hope to imagine, the courage and the hope to imagine a more a less apocalyptic, or even a totally non-apocalyptic future, that by then imagining it, maybe we can draw ourselves forward into that. And I'm supposed to give a talk on Sunday, and they said, oh, you know, my task was give the people hope, which is quite a challenge. So I was actually going to ask you to help me. Maybe you can give me hope, and then I can give everybody else hope, and we can share. And I know it's not an easy ask, but should we start with the sound of the bell?
Yeah, so we just we have a bell in the monastery. It helps us come back to our breathing and just establish ourselves in the present moment. And we invite Bill to share. Should I ask a question? Yeah. So one question that we had for you, Bill, was just seeing how much energy you have you put in every day to helping the planet and building movements that can contribute to a collective awakening. How do you maintain your energy and well-being in the midst of such intense activism? What is your secret?
Well, I don't always, and there've definitely been moments over the last 3 decades when I've been pretty depressed and despondent at what's afoot, because because it's incredibly scary. This is the largest thing that's ever happened on our planet, at least in human time. And it's happening, and this is important, extremely fast. And we have, unlike other problems that we face, a very limited amount of time in which to deal with it. And if we don't, then we won't be able to. And so those are things that can let one get very sad sometimes, especially because the root unfairness of climate change is so deep and so real. If there's an iron law of global warming, it's that those who did the least to cause it feel its effects first and hardest. And so, certainly out of my faith tradition, I'm a Methodist. And I think out of all faith and moral traditions, really, that adds to the emotional power of the moment we're in. That said, I'm able mostly to keep going and fighting because over the years, so many other people have joined in. There was a period early on, I wrote the first book about all this, as you said, and for 5 or 6 years, there was that odd feeling you sometimes get when you're in a nightmare and you can see some monster coming, but you're unable to communicate with anyone around you. You can't talk or something. And it was that was quite hard. But now, with each passing year, because of the organizing that so many people have done, there's a huge movement of people that builds. When we started 350.org about a decade ago, it was kind of the first iteration of a global grassroots climate movement, and it kind of helped things get going. But now there's so many other wonderful things that have joined in. So Phoebe working hard with Extinction Rebellion, or the incredible work that diplomats around the world managed to do to pull off the Paris Climate Accords in 2015 against all odds, or the rise of young people, first in the United States, demanding a kind of Green New Deal and figuring out some ways forward. And then beautifully, the rise of junior high and high school age students around the world. I've gotten to know Greta Thunberg, and she's a friend, and I adore her. But the really good news is there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs all over the planet, young people who do astonishing work. So now there's a movement of people in place. And history indicates that it's only when we build movements like that we're able to stand up to concentrations of wealth and power. We have we have two great gifts, I think, from the 20th century. One is the development of new technologies, particularly the solar panel, that are quite remarkable gifts. The idea that you can glass at the sun and out the back will flow light and information and the blessings of modernity is remarkable. I mean, that's Hogwarts scale magic, and we don't always notice it exactly, but it's truly important. And because the engineers have brought the price of this down so far, now we really could deploy sun and wind with great speed to get done what we need doing. The other great gift of the 20th century, I think, the other technology that we lean on and that gives me hope, is the development of the nonviolent social movement. Great leaders like the suffragists or Gandhi or Dr. King, always operating at the margins of society, understood this new method of allowing change, allowing the many, the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few in a new and remarkable way. So I guess what I'd say is, what's odd about this fight is we don't know if we're going to win. most of the time, I think humans can take a long view and say, eventually we will. In this case, we don't know. And that level of unsettling uncertainty about whether we can move fast enough should haunt all of us all the time. But the good news is that there are more and more and more people all the time of good faith and good heart engaged in this work.
Mm-hmm.
So wonderful.
Yeah.
So wonderful to hear. I know when I think of Greta Thunberg and the 10,000 others, as you mentioned, I feel it in my whole body. It's kind of like, the new generation of activists, of powerful thinkers, and people who can feel and see into a new vision. They're here and they're speaking, and they're not afraid to tell the truth to power. And I think that does us all good. Maybe I wonder, could we invite Phoebe to comment or share and maybe ask a question or two?
Thank you. I'm a big fan of your work, Bill. So just to first say thank you so much. And when I was a college student, I started the fossil-free divestment campaign at Imperial College, and so like big respect, and really good to be on a call together. And I've been on a journey of starting life as a scientist. I worked in the field of biofuels and genetic engineering, and really believing that technology was the answer to changing the world. And from that place, became quite disillusioned with technology, because I felt actually we have all the technology we need right here, right now. So why are we stuck in these loops? Why are we going towards this cliff edge? And that journey has taken me into the world of working on kind of organizing and governance, and how are decisions made, and how can we work with people. And then from there, in more recent times, I've gone kind of even further into the space of narratives and stories and myths, and what I'm calling the moral imagination, because more and more I feel like the thing that is holding us back from changing the world or changing the system, changing how we live, is this invisible this thing of perception, of how we perceive the world, how we perceive the natural world and each other. And we don't see what's really there. We don't see that it's beautiful. And when we look at a tree, we see how much furniture its wood can make. We don't see a vibrant, living, interdependent, unbelievable being. So that's almost just like what's on my mind is firstly, I'd love to just hear what you think of that journey, and whether it speaks to you, and where you stand between technologies that could change everything, but these narratives and myths. And then another question would be, what are the myths that you feel really have power to bring people into a place of inspiration, and the power and the energy to really fight for what they love?
Those are such beautiful questions. First of all, so many thanks for your work around divestment. I'll just say in passing, this proves to have been one of the really epic parts of this fight so far. And we're now at about $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have universities, churches, whatever, that have divested their holdings in fossil fuel. And it was really important because, most people don't have a coal mine in their backyard or a pipeline running through the neighborhood, but everybody's near some pile of money someplace that was playing a role in helping wreck the planet. And so watching people, in particular young people, stand up to that's really been exciting. And it's one of the 2 or 3 things that's really paid off in terms of putting huge pressure on the system. So I'm also really happy, Phoebe, for your kind of transition into this other work, because I think it's really important. I remember writing once that, you know, a new metaphor is probably as important as a new engine in the ways that, helping us understand how to see the world around us. And this is one of the places, it seems to me, where faith communities of one kind or another are super important, because they manage to exist a little bit outside the kind of conventional wisdom of the world. That is, you know, there remain some parts of our society that can posit some reason other than accumulation for human existence. And so those become very subversive and important ideas, you know, countercultural ideas, sort of literally. And one of those, I think, is the one that you're, you know, wrestling with so beautifully, Phoebe. The notion that that we're not at the center of things necessarily, that we're a part of things. And I think one way to imagine it, to say it, is that it's quite possible to me that our job in this century is to figure out ways to make ourselves somewhat smaller. You know, human beings, their position vis-a-vis the rest of the world was always, we're small on a large world whose forces can overwhelm us, you know. And that's, you know, our conception of God in many traditions is very tied in with those, you know, that sort of large, well, sometime in the 20th century, right about the moment we learned to explode nuclear weapons, that arithmetic flipped. And suddenly humans were very large in comparison with the world around them. Now, thank heaven, we've managed to restrain ourselves when it comes to dropping nuclear weapons. We were, I think, able in our imaginations to see those mushroom clouds once we exploded them over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We were able to see those in our imagination and so go to work. But it was much harder for our imaginations to imagine that the explosion of billions of pistons and billions of cylinders every second of every minute of every hour of every day could wreak the same kind of damage on the planet. It turns out, though, that they can't. That's what climate change is. That's what the molecular structure of CO2 does. And so figuring out how to, I mean, we now cast a very large shadow, and I think a shadow larger than we're comfortable with, you know, in at some very root way as human beings. And so figuring out how to make ourselves somewhat smaller in lots of ways seems very key. And it seems to me a kind of key theological question too, for me, one of the most important documents so far this millennium was Pope Francis's extremely eloquent encyclical on climate change, Laudato Si, which begins talking about global warming, but really is a critique of modernity in many ways, including the fact that modernity proves so devastating for so many people on the margins. So whether one's looking at a tree or one is looking at a slum or one is looking at the latest science, it's, you know, that sense of perspective and figuring out how to take ourselves out of the center a little bit seems crucial to me.
Thank you. I wonder if we could bring in Felipe at this point, because he's been working a lot with kind of bringing in indigenous narratives and wisdom traditions, and maybe inviting them to lead and share their wisdom with us. Kind of, it's almost as if in the West we've amputated that part of ourselves. You know, maybe the witch trials and so on. We kind of we lost so much of our wisdom, but luckily it hasn't all been lost, and maybe some of it has been preserved for us in different pockets, in different places in the world. I don't know if Felipe, you can speak to that.
Yes, thanks, Brother Phap. Yeah, so I've been working in the intersection of indigenous rights and earth rights and the environmental movement for a long time. And as Brother Phap Linh was saying, in terms of how can we tell the story of the climate crisis, of the of in a way the moment of transition and initiation that we're going as a species is tricky, because people often feel very scared and overwhelmed. So I think part of my work is, as Br Phap Luu was saying, just to listen more and to see if and what is in terms of indigenous wisdom, in terms of technologies, in terms of science. And I'm working right now in a campaign in the Amazon with a bunch of other organizations. There's an indigenous-led movement, and part of the stories and in a way the meme at the core of the work is this sense of cura da terra, the cure of the earth. Indigenous wisdom, indigenous technologies can be a cure, a way to heal the earth. And indigenous is a problematic word too, because indigenous come from the Latin and means it belongs to a place. So it's a way of othering people, and to say, you guys being colonized and you're indigenous and we are modern and we're cool. And so I think my question is, yeah, is around this sense of, in your experience, in your work, yeah, how do you see indigenous wisdom, and what's the role of indigenous technology and ecosystem management? And I've done a lot of studies and spend time with indigenous people learning about the sense of ecosystem management, traditional ecological knowledge, and not just the kind of like the soft skills, but really there is a science of observing and living with nature for thousands and thousands of years. The Aboriginals in Australia, they talk about maybe 60,000 years or 100,000 years. So, and then I will finish with this. I'll pass on to you. I was at the dinner party on Monday in London, and they were saying, people have been living, humanity have been living for most of our history, however long, using renewable energies, and now for the last 100, we mess things up. So I think, yeah, the question is, how do you see, because you are right now in a whatever indigenous country, and how in your career, your inspiration, how do you see that?
So Felipe, what good questions, and thank you for your work. And what a good chance to get to say something that I keep repeating over and over again, but I think is really true. Maybe the single most useful thing that's happened in the environmental movement in the last decade is the degree to which indigenous communities around the world have kind of stepped into the forefront. Also, what we call frontline communities, communities of color in general, but indigenous communities are playing a particular role for a few reasons. Some of them just almost by accident. That is, on the North American continent, and to some degree elsewhere in the world, when colonizers arrived, they pushed indigenous people off into lands that they thought didn't have any value. And it turns out now, in the 21st century, that land is either on top of a lot of coal and gas and oil, or it's astride the routes you'd need to send a pipeline or something through to get coal and gas and oil from someplace else. So the leadership role that people have been playing is immense. I really first got into this work of fighting pipelines and things because of wonderful indigenous friends in Canada who taught me all about the tar sands up in Alberta. And that's kind of where we began the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. that's blossomed into a lot of other things. In North America, people tended to really recognize this a few years ago during the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, which became one of the great iconic moments. But it didn't surprise me in the least, because these were people who'd been working hard for a long time. As we speak today, people in the Tsayal-Waututh community in British Columbia are blockading the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the Pacific Ocean, and we should keep them in our thoughts. But it's not just North America, as you point out. Across the Amazon, across the Andes, in South America, Indigenous communities are at the forefront. In Australia, where Aboriginal people have been fighting with enormous power to try and beat coal mines. Some of my favorite colleagues in this work that I talk to and work with regularly are in the South Pacific, on those islands that are very well may not exist by the end of this century. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And they're fighting in remarkable ways, non-violently. I'll never forget watching the, people from each of those islands build a traditional canoe and then take them to Newcastle in Australia, which is the largest coal port in the world, and use those canoes to blockade in for a day the biggest ore ships in the world to keep them from getting the coal out to Asia. It was a truly powerful and important protest, and those sort of things go on day after day. But it's not just that functional leadership role. It's also, Felipe, as you suggest, a kind of intellectual leadership role. One of the things that makes this moment so useful, I think, is that the very oldest wisdom traditions on our planet, indigenous wisdom traditions, and the very newest wisdom traditions, our most advanced science, are beginning to tell us largely the same thing. That is, the view from the sweat lodge and the view from the supercomputer and the satellite are agreeing on the fact that we cannot continue doing what we're doing. Basically, what both those worldviews are saying is the conventional wisdom that most of us hold, that we're just going to keep living in ever larger economies and whatever, is wrong-headed and not where we want to be anyway. So I think that's a moment of extraordinary power, that convergence of the very ancient and the very modern. And it's up to the rest of us to try and decipher and deduce what we can from all of that, and really to fall in line as best we can behind the people who understand best precisely how to. Now, that's not to put an undue burden on the 4 or 5% of people on the planet who are indigenous. It's not their job to save the earth any more than it's the job of junior high school students led by Greta Thunberg to save the earth. But those are precisely the places that people should be looking to for a lot of guidance and leadership as they go into action here.
I think this leads, for me at least, to the question of the role that community can play, because that's one thing that the indigenous communities have never forgotten. That the importance of living in multi-generational inclusive communities, and I think we know that the evidence is in, as it were, in terms of happiness research. We know that living in bigger houses with more cars and more money and consuming more doesn't actually make us any happier, but probably less, if anything. And it certainly makes us more isolated and lonely, and this sense of kind of spiritual malaise and disconnection, I think is growing the more we consume and the more we live in these ways. And certainly for us in our community, this is something that we constantly emphasize, that it's possible to live in community. It's possible to live with a lot less, to share resources, to share cars and washing machines and this kind of stuff. And and that it's actually a source of joy and nourishment too. So I wanted, maybe Naima would like to comment on that. I know she's been very involved in this movement as well, which is increasing for, I think, young people in urban centers, also thinking more about living together in community and the benefits of that. And then maybe we pass back to Bill, because I know that's something you've also written and shared a lot about over the years.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first of all, to say to Bill again, thanks so much for all your work. You know, I've lived and breathed climate change my whole life because of my mother, Christiana, and just amazing to be a witness to everything that's progressed since. I'm also here with Pablo Jenkins, who's a regenerative futurist, and on the topic of communities. We've actually just been here the last week. We're here in Costa Rica and gathering with several people, really to see what is emerging and really dropping into silence and into meditation and allowing in a space of community to see what's emerging. And something that's been very powerful lately is so I've been facilitating different types of circles, of sharing circles, and a practice that we incorporated is co-visioning, right? And if we accept and understand that we are creators of our reality and that we can imagine and create towards what we envision, the more that we can come together and co-vision that together, the power that can be behind that. I'm also co-founder of Conscious Co-Living, as mentioned before, and we've been really seeing, you know, at the core, our core manifesto is around connection with self, connection with others, and connection with nature, and how community can really, living in conscious community can really help enhance those connections, which we see are vital for the crisis and the transformation in which we're in. And I guess a question that we've been, you know, really asking ourselves these days is, how can countries like Costa Rica, like New Zealand, who have a you know, not just a GDP focus, but more of a well-being focus, right? Bhutan, you know, how can these be examples for the world, and what are other models that we're already seeing in terms of a regenerative future, in terms of the new earth paradigm that we're creating, and especially what is the role of community in that? And maybe Pablo, if you want to add a word.
So, and briefly, I think I've been actually talking to Felipe for a while. We've been working, for example, with Bhutan and Costa Rica, and even thinking of bringing family offices. As you know, the amount of wealth that in this decade, many families will inherit to a next generation, that will probably invest differently. But sometimes things that can be done at scale, like solar panels, should be balanced with things that can be done at smaller scales. So we spent all this week actually working in Nosara as a regenerative community that in Costa Rica in the 70s had been made into pastures, and now it's one of the most, again, abundant and biodiverse places, which also shows you could have had some flawed policies, that you don't just try to not cut more, but people, community, and nature thrive back. And the very concrete thing we were discussing is, I've been actually talking also with the people, with a lot of the people working in Iceland, same examples as New Zealand. If we had some of the role of smaller countries, you know, the G20 and some others are very important because of the size. But in the story making and storytelling and actually showing that it is possible with both the wisdom from Earth and the Aboriginal, I feel in Costa Rica to some extent, the nature is our spiritual practice, like it's some parts of the shamanic cultures, and the way in Bhutan and the traditions from Tibet are millenary, but they have a similar part, the sense of separation. There can be no well-being and thriving in a failed, so to speak, planet or society. And that's not something we hope to do in 20 years or when you're rich or when you get technology. There was just a way of living that actually exists now in the present and looks like elements of what we hope the future to be like. How can we best connect this? So let's say maybe the 800 million people in Africa that will be living in a very different setting at the beginning and at the end of the decade don't end up compelled to copy other models when we have firsthand people like us connected to the networks and the knowledge you've done, but also living this, at least at small scale in the present, even at country levels.
Yeah, these are such interesting ideas and important ones. And thank you too for all that work in Costa Rica, which really is one of the most remarkable places on the planet. And just in passing, among other things, demonstrates how much you can get done if you decide that having an army is not your top priority as a country. The basic issue here, I think, is profound, almost beyond belief. In Western consumer culture over the last 7-8 decades, we've lived through something that's come to seem to us as normal, but in fact is quite abnormal in human history. This hyper-individualism that really is what a consumer society kind of requires in a consumer economy to run, at least at the pitch that we've been running it. It requires you putting yourself first and others last. That's kind of how it works. You know, I've lived my whole life in the political shadow of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who really changed our conception around these things. It was Margaret Thatcher who said, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And that point of view, that kind of laissez-faire, neoliberal, highly competitive, highly individual economic system lies pretty profoundly at the root of a lot of the trouble we've wandered into, in part because it's highly successful at doing the thing that it does. I mean, if what you want to do is generate as much stuff as possible, that's the system you'd pick if you didn't care what it was doing to people and you didn't care what it was doing to the planet. We're beginning, I think, to see profound reactions against that, even in those countries. And here maybe we should just say that the COVID crisis really offers some powerful lessons about how to look at the future. Some of them are obvious. Physical reality is real, you have to pay attention to it. If the COVID microbe says wear a mask, wear a mask. Doesn't matter that, you know, you're Donald Trump and you don't want to wear one and whatever, it's just dumb. Second, physical reality is, you know, speed matters. If you don't get ahead of curves, then you're way behind, and that's a big problem. But I think the deepest lesson goes right to what we've been saying, which is that on all the problems that we face, climate above all, social solidarity really is going to be the most important thing that we have. Ronald Reagan's most famous laugh line in his speeches always was, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. He said those were the 9 scariest words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. You know, ha, ha, ha. It was all part of this idea of putting down the idea that we could work cooperatively together and instead replacing it with the idea that markets would solve all problems and tell us what to do and so on. But it turns out that the scariest words in the English language are, our hospital has run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is caught on fire. And you can't solve those unless you work together. And so learning again how to work together seems to me as, you know, the single most important skill that we have. I mean, most of the skills that we need, you know, are very connected to the particular place you're in and how much sunlight it gets or how much wind or, you know, I mean, there's a trillion different solutions to the physical problems that we face, depending on where we are and so on. But the thing that underlies them all is the necessity of being able to work together, to recognize other people and maybe other parts of creation too as possessing real value and real importance and a real claim on all of us. So that, I think, is, it just could not be more important. I will say that, important as it is to figure out all these new ways and to communicate with them, each other, and to dig into the wonderful ancient wisdoms that we have to work with and so on, it also, none of it allows us to avoid also the very immediate fight that we're in. And we have to be able to stand up to powers like the fossil fuel industry, and we have to do it very fast. I said earlier that the particular physics and chemistry of climate change inform this fight. And if we had 75 years or 150 years or 400 years to deal with this problem, we would have a whole different set of solutions and priorities and pathways. But because we don't, because we only have a matter of years, perhaps a decade or two if we're lucky, our pathways are somewhat constrained. And so all of us need to be working to figure out how to make lives work where we are and draw on those traditions and make them work. All of us also have to be able to give a little bit of energy and time to this sort of joint project around the world of standing up to the biggest forces in the planet and breaking their political power. Because if we can't do that, then we're going to get, all the rest is just going to be nice stuff around the edges. So it's a dual moment that we're in, and I take enormous courage and confidence from the people here on all the stuff that they're engaged in.
That leads us, I think, to another question which somebody wrote in by email, and I think it would be good maybe to, I know in terms of time, maybe we need to draw things gradually to a close. I wanted to invite Phap Luu also to share a little bit from our point of view. I think the whole of our technology, as it were, that we offer as a monastery, as a spiritual tradition, is all about, learning again how to live together, how to work together, how to cooperate, how to get out of even just the idea of separation and individuality, and start seeing the world in a new way in terms of interconnection. But maybe before that, just as a last question to Bill, when you're faced with, for want of a better word, kind of climate apathy, I think it's not a moral judgment. It's what I notice for people who don't seem yet to be ready to kind of take up the cause and act, is maybe that they're overwhelmed emotionally. Maybe it's just that the emotion is so great that they don't have the resources to embrace it. It's just terrifying. So the easiest thing is, another episode of something on Netflix, or just cover it up in any way possible. But that can lead to a kind of like, I don't want to know. It's too much. I can't handle it. Don't tell me about it. I think most of us who post things online or on social media, on Twitter, I certainly notice there's a kind of unfollow effect. Like whenever you just raise people's awareness about, like, Siberia's on fire, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as anywhere else in the world, or even more. And I think there's just a number of people who are kind of like, I don't want that in my news. I don't want to hear about it. It's too painful. It's too difficult. So the question is, do you have any success stories from your experience of being able to kind of aikido that apathy and turn it into engagement, enthusiasm, courage, and hope?
So what a good question. Two things. First one is, some of that's unavoidable, so don't despair at it. The good news is that, making change doesn't require that you get 51% of people engaged in something. And the reason that it doesn't is because apathy cuts both ways, like we have to work, we had to work. I remember when we did the first great climate march, it took a year's work to get 400,000 people in the streets in New York. And it was, you know, all the work of building coalitions and of, you know, acquiring porta potties and, you know, all the other things that it takes to do that. The one thing we didn't worry about was that the next day there'd be 400,000 people in the street demanding more climate change, you know. So the point is that, you know, what the literature seems to tell us is if you can get 4 or 5% of people engaged in a fight, that's usually enough to win. And so we should take some heart from that because we're getting nearer those kind of numbers. Now, to the deeper question of how to get people engaged, I think your intuition is exactly correct. It's not that most people don't understand that this is a crisis. You'd have to be willfully obtuse not to at this point, because you can look out, you know, every day on the TV and see a forest on fire or a city underwater or whatever it is. The problem I've always thought is that climate change seems incredibly large and we seem in its face incredibly small. So what could we do that would have any impact on it? And that's actually a correct intuition. There really is nothing as individuals that any of us are going to do at this late date to change the math here. And that's why I think people, young people especially, sometimes rebel when they're told that, you know, the answer is new light bulbs or whatever. I mean, yes, they're good, they're important. I'm very proud of all my solar panels on the roof, whatever, but I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to win this fight. You can't make the math work in the time that we have, one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time, whatever. So that's really one of the reasons that we build movements, is to allow people to see that there's a plausible chance that they actually do have some agency to make big change, to change the fundamental rules of the game that could produce outsized shifts in the level of carbon in the atmosphere. And a way of saying this is, at this point in time, the most important and in some ways most heartening thing an individual can do is be a little bit less of an individual, is come together with others in movements large enough to make a difference. And as we do that kind of organizing, then people, I've seen 1,000 times, people suddenly kind of take courage and say, okay, that makes sense to me now. Here I am at Imperial College in the UK working for divestment, and I can do that because I know who the Board of Trustees is and how I can affect them. And I understand that simultaneously there are 1 million other people at institutions around the world making the same case, and that it will add up to something larger than the sum of its parts, and it presents some plausible pathway forward that's at a scale equivalent to the scale of the problem that we face. So that's why I've come to think that organizing is such a kind of key thing, and such a key human skill, key part of being human. Is all an organizer is someone who's able to talk with the people around them and get them working together in the same direction. And that's desperately what we need right now. So that's the closest to a kind of elixir that I've found to allow people to get the kind of courage that's required to stare quite plainly at the crisis that we're in and not blink and not turn away, and if they're shedding a tear, which they should be, nonetheless be able to see through those tears where we need to be going and how we're going to get there.
It's just, I really appreciate that you bring up the non-fear. How do we cultivate and train ourselves to look in the face of hatred or despair with the eyes of non-fear? I just share, I remember there was a moment when I was, before I was a monk, I was also an activist, and we did a campaign against the arms trade in England. And we had a kind of die-in at a place where the conference was happening, where they were selling on the side these kind of the anti-personnel grenades. And I remember this moment when one of the generals who was going into the conference kind of stopped and said, "Well, what are you guys here for?" And here we were, like, full of anger and full of, like, and here he was, like, there was this moment where he was American, I'm American, and we just had this exchange, and I had a long beard and looked like an anarchist, and I remember just being that a moment of, you said about this is a dual moment, but this was a kind of non-dual moment where suddenly the humanity of everyone comes out, and you realize that we're actually not on separate sides, that we all love the planet, that we all love the earth, and that we are all playing kind of a role in that moment based on our how we are manifesting actually the Mother Earth nature that is in us. That's one of our teachings, is we learn to see that we are not separate from the earth. Mother Earth is in every cell of our body. And so I guess I'd like to just hear more about, because you mentioned this is a dual moment, and it's very clear that there are very strong forces under play. But how we've also worked in our work here in a spiritual community with many people who are changing the hearts of those who are in the industries, who are in who have the power to make changes, to divest. And a lot of that comes from the spirit of non-dualism, of not seeing, we're like playing roles that we are climate activists and they are the enemy. But actually in that moment when the humanity comes out, you see that actually we all care about each other. There's love that is infusing every aspect of our being, whether, even though it seems that fossil fuel executive
this is why
yeah.
This is why Buddhists are far more advanced than Methodists in this group. I confess that I don't think at this point there's any substitute for actually having to very firmly confront those what the good book calls the powers and principalities of our time. So, I've ended up, in jail more times than I would have expected. Most recently in January, before the pandemic, at the branch of the Chase Manhattan Bank nearest the Capitol, because Chase Bank is the biggest lender in the world to the fossil fuel industry. They send them hundreds of billions of dollars every year to wreck the planet. And at this point, that's not okay. And so I think that, I take your point completely about a shared humanity, but I think that we may be at the moment when one of our jobs is to help people understand when they're not living up to what that shared humanity requires. And sometimes that has to be in very plain spoken and firm ways. I'm deeply committed to nonviolence, but that doesn't mean for me that there aren't moments when I get angry as hell at these guys, because every day now, thousands of people die because of, we're going to lose a third, a half the species on this planet in the course of this century. And none of this is necessary at this point. We have other ways, but it's required because there are a fairly small number of people, powerful people on the planet, as yet unwilling to give up the particular kinds of power and wealth that they have. So this, as I say, it's probably a good thing that there, it's definitely a good thing that there's a lot of wise Buddhists on the planet, and it's probably a good thing there's a few, angry Methodists left roaming around too, and together we may hit some kind of good balance someplace that get done what needs done.
Thank you so much. Wise words, wise words.
Oh, thank you guys so much. I unfortunately have to go, but I'm so grateful to y'all and to Phoebe, Felipe, and to Naima, and it shouldn't go without saying publicly that Naima's mother has been one of the 4 or 5 people on this planet who has done more to make it possible for us to imagine a future than just about anybody else. And getting to work with her has always been a tremendous honor. And obviously Thich Nhat Hanh, the same, one of those people that that all of us benefit enormously from. So thank you all, and blessings to you all, and on we go.
Well, maybe just on behalf of all of us here in Plum Village and all of us joining for the retreat and maybe watching online, I really just want to express our very heartfelt gratitude for your being, Bill, not just your doing, but your being, for who you are and how you manifest in the world, is really an inspiration to us all and to so many more. And it's very moving to be with you as a wise elder and to kind of receive the benefit of your contemplation, your experience, but also your activism and your willingness to kind of put yourself in harm's way or in danger potentially. And I think we all aspire to that as well. We're not, although we may be in the monastery, our tradition is very much an engaged tradition. And I'm kind of, I think they almost, when we were at an Extinction Rebellion event last year, I was kind of like, where do I get arrested? Let me chain myself to something. So I'm sure that time will come too. And and I think you really are an inspiration to us all. So thank you to everyone for your presence, participation, and we're all breathing with you in every moment. And if there's any way that our community can show up more, be present more for the work that you're doing, then please don't hesitate. We are here, and that is really in our hearts.
God bless. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bill.
So should we end, or should we do a little guided? Okay. So dear friends, Bill had to leave the session, but we wanted, because we replaced the sitting meditation with this session, we wanted to just take a few minutes to close with a little guided meditation to help us all to feel what we're feeling in our bodies, in our hearts, to allow us to receive more deeply everything that we've heard and felt, and also let it go and just be present with the next new moment as it arises. So let us find a comfortable position. Go back upright, allowing our spine to be straight but relaxed. We can just be aware of our in-breath, aware of our out-breath. Breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I'm breathing out. Aware of the in-breath, aware of the out-breath. Breathing in, I'm aware that this in-breath is the out-breath of the trees. Breathing out, I'm aware that this out-breath is the in-breath of the trees. This in-breath, the out-breath of the trees. This out-breath, the in-breath of the trees. With this in-breath, I feel my connection to all of life on this planet. With this out-breath, I allow myself to rest in the wisdom, compassion, and inclusiveness of this planet. Breathing in, I am connected. Breathing out, I rest in the wisdom, compassion, and inclusiveness of that connection. Breathing in, I experience my body as just a tiny part of this beautiful jewel, which is Mother Earth. Breathing out, I experience Mother Earth as my body. Breathing in, I am a part of Mother Earth. Breathing out, Mother Earth is me. Breathing in, I'm aware that the calcium in my bones was produced in the hearts of ancient stars, and I participate in the life of stars. Breathing out, I know that I am not limited by this body or this lifespan. Breathing in, participating in the lifetime of stars. Breathing out, not limited by body or lifespan. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Shan.
Thank you, Phap Linh. It's beautiful.
Thank you to everyone for joining us for this intergalactic adventure. And we look forward to meeting together again, online and offline, in the relative and in the ultimate. We wish everybody a peaceful night's rest.